So I asked, in the Old Testament it tells us that the apostasy of Israel was building fortified cities and palaces, yet the Catholic Church made palaces and fortified cities to head its church offices. This is a sign of apostasy also of the Christian church. In the Old Testament, and particularly in the prophet Hosea, the apostasy of sin, or sin of building palaces and fortified cities, was often linked to reliance on human power rather than divine protection. But whether the Catholic Church's history of building grand structures is a sign of apostasy, theologians, historians generally view it through different lenses. Many reformers and critics argue that the accumulation of temporal wealth and defensive fortifications like the walls of Vatican City represent a departure from the humility of the early church. Humility. Why don't you just say it's sin, man? The church became a political state rather than a spiritual body. Grand palaces can be seen as a distraction from the mission to serve the poor. Is that all? Physical fortifications suggest a lack of trust in God's providence. Became a political state rather than a spiritual body. No. Why isn't it the same? Generally justifies the structure as necessary for its mission. Sin that it was in the Old Testament. Same God. Provide a space community. During the Middle Ages, Renaissance church held territory and needed to protect its independence from warring monarchs. Fortified cities were a means of survival and sovereignty. The temple model. Rather than looking at the warnings of Hosea, this sin wasn't the stone and mortar itself, but the heart of the people. Trust in human power over divine protection. For Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities, but I will send fire upon his cities, and it shall consume his palaces. Palaces symbolize a shift towards materialism and luxury that accompanies a departure from divine dependence. The Lord God has sworn by himself, I abhor the pride of Jacob and hate his palaces, therefore I will deliver up the city and all that is in it. The thing is, even David, and he wanted to make his mansion and stuff. God had told him, he was defeating the armies and stuff, and he's winning all those victories while he was living in tents. And he's worried about getting a mansion. This false sense of invincibility, leading the people to believe they were secure apart from God. No, so they were outnumbered a lot, and it was like miracles were happening on the war field. I mean, I read it like there's one part where it's saying that David's saying, he'd turn his head, they'd be fighting a giant, and if he turned his head and looked back, the giant would disappear. It was gone. God would get rid of the giant by making him disappear on the war battlefield. So, the city of David were many, but you did not look to him. It warns about picking, and the thing is, think of us. Think about, so we have an issue right now. I mean, the fire hasn't come down on our cities, but are they no longer are our cities, the American people. They belong. They used to be a bunch of Christian people who came over here, built these, and then some of them built cities. Not everyone, but some of them built cities. Like my family stayed in they had little cities, not big fortified cities. I just came from one I was born in, and They're not fortified cities. And that's where my family's been for centuries, in little cities that they built them, own themselves, and were state. I mean, there were several people in my relatives who were started towns, and the towns never even got very big. There may be like 17,000 people in some of the biggest ones, except for San Francisco was where some of my family members had ended up being the first people among the first people, not the very first or whatever, like setting up the courts and the neighborhoods there, the first neighborhoods. But the Peacocks and then some of the Elkins had gone over there. But the thing is, that we have cities overrun by immigrants, by people who are from nations that are Muslim, by Mexicans and Africans, and we don't have our cities anymore. They took them away. But wasn't it? Maybe it was a sin to build these cities. And the same thing, and it just wasn't an Old Testament prophet telling us, but it did tell Israel. And it's the same thing, same God, same sin. So it's probably what happened. But the thing is, our military. I mean, it's talking about God as a defense, and they just came here anyways. It doesn't mean we don't have a God. That just meant that there's a lot of rich people who no longer have the cities they built. They look at their artisanship, their skilled labor, their everything. They're so good, and they're better at everything. They work so, they got this luxury, and they can afford all this, and they're so important and more important than all of us. And then they lost their cities. Now they're busted because they were raping kids, which is like, there's no way to understand. But they haven't opened the Michael Jackson case up again, but we still got the Epstein files, and we know P. Diddy's guilty. They just won't bust him. They got him for they got him for a few things. They always got to go for a few years, but really he's, I mean, come on, how much did they let him get away with? And I don't know. It's maybe his people just let him get away more than, and they call it racism when our people try to bust him. So he's getting away because of the race card. But I don't know, I mean, they turned our cities, our country, into a third world. They built their own third world country here, right in the midst of us. So maybe it's just how godless and sinful a city is. Not just Las Vegas is sinful, but all these cities, right? I'm not saying this because of me. I'm just, but I do know the difference, because I had lived for a time on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, as a kid. But then at the same time, my families were mostly homesteaders, and they had dairies, they had homesteads, they had orchards and different things like that, and they're just small cities people. Well, actually, I don't think there were any really city people. They had moved to town, because they either sold their little farm or decided they wanted to live in town. It was, for some reason. but they were never that. They weren't big like big city people. Anyways. So, and I lived a lot of time in small towns, most of my time. So I know about small, medium-sized cities, ones that aren't big, not suburbs or anything. They're just towns and cities. Nowadays, they try to make every single town a suburb because you got people from the big cities wanting to get out of the big city, so they got to have a place to work. So then they try to build these little small corporation companies and find some. Of course, they bring in these chains, your franchise chains, and the strip malls, so they can work at the stores, or they can, make their little suburb. It's not like a big city or a real suburb when they do it, because they're towns that were never built as a suburb. They were built for the farmers who lived around them and stuff. But we're all, they start this woke stuff and the socialism, the communism. The thing is the KGB knew we had small towns and cities, and they built mock. There's if you look on, there's a old CIA stuff online, training. It talks about KGB having a mock city in Russia. They had one that was to replicate the small town or small cities in America, for KGB to train. They live in and train to learn how to live in a small town, to blend in, to not stand out. So they were hitting our small towns, their agents, so they could, and what their mission was to subvert, to demoralize, and get people to side, do the left-wing thing, or rebel, or just create a lot of mistrust, and get people to minds off Christianity. They were doing communist atheism and demoralizing countries blatantly, so they could bring in communism as an option to replace what American government, which eventually happened with the hippies. And nowadays, look what we got. So, I don't know, this is only AI's answer, but do you think America See, it's saying that it says in the Bible, God calls the Assyrian Empire the rod of my anger, using a foreign nation as an instrument to discipline Israel for its ungodliness and wrath. Oh no! And some of these people may be from the old Assyrian Empire that are in our cities. Loss of sovereignty. The punishment for relying on fortified cities rather than God was that those cities were surrendered to others. In Amos 6:8, God swears to deliver up the city and all that is in it because he abhors the pride of Jacob. Oh no, that's what happened. It's just a different lens. It was a symptom of a nation that had become spiritually gray-headed and weak without realizing it. See? Couldn't have sexual revolution. They couldn't have a bunch of gay guys dressed up like women in Hollywood. Deuteronomy 28:49-52 warns that if the nation turns from God, he will bring a nation from afar to besiege you in all your gates until you hide fortified walls in which you trust come down. That's what's happening, folks.